Well, I've got this idea clearly in my head. I guess I'll try and record it. It's to do with science. So, I don't think I've made a video critiquing scientism yet. I have sort of published opinions, or published on forums, written essays about this topic almost exhaustively. But anyway, okay, so let me just articulate the basic position, which is that science is kind of the philosophical framework is very flimsy as it currently stands, and it has been like that for a while. Ever since quantum mechanics, really. So there's a good way to summarize this whole point, is that so let me start with, I guess, the alternative or the answer as I see it, and then work back from there and get into the philosophical issues. So the correct position, in my view, is that quantum mechanics sort of affirms quite clearly agent causation of the species that Aristotle even articulated. That it very clearly affirms was it a double barrel title? I think it's just called agent causation. Yeah. So, and that becomes more, let's say, metaphysically elaborated, as you start understanding science in that philosophical framework, which changes the general conceptual treatment of time by science, which is just horrendous, which is why quantum mechanics looks as philosophically schismatic as it is. I mean, the two basic okay, so the sort of this comes to me because I just wrote a very small comment on a sort of on somebody else's science YouTube dealing with quantum mechanics, but like the many worlds interpretation basically is really garbage. It's just you're basically taking math to be the sort of deity. That if you take the many worlds interpretation, you are literally displacing empiricism with math. There's no two ways about it. Like there's just, I mean, everything that science supposedly uses to substantiate itself is just completely obviated by that position. It's such a garbage philosophical position. So you literally are worshipping mathematics as being, sort of mathematics, which is an abstract thing which can never have a sort of empirical falsification for it. So you're just saying because math, the many worlds must be true. It is really pathetic. So I mean, you've literally just converted science into a faith-based position at that point. So I mean, I guess something like the Copenhagen interpretation leaves room for something like agent causation. The main problem, and obviously why people want to move away from the Copenhagen interpretation, is because it seems to not fit well with how science is generally conceived of. And you have this problem as well, actually, with special relativity, because someone has actually given an opinion similar to this. The mathematician that was interviewed by Paul Rubin on the Rubin report, is going to say something. It says something similar as to what I'm about to espouse, which is that basically what Einstein did was he took two equations and he found a way to intersect them at such a point that it sort of cancels out, let's call it, certain of the philosophical murky areas, and in the intersection of those two equations, what you get is a sort of replication of a Newtonian mind frame. So it's sort of, that's why it was so well received. It's because it works so well. The formulas work so well, and that I also see as somewhat schismatic, because there are. I didn't want to. I mean, I'm talking about quantum stuff, so I'd rather go into quantum stuff and juxtapose that with the actual philosophical framework of the scientific method, because that is definitely fertile ground. And if I talk too much about relativity, which the equations themselves. I remember conceptually considering these things a long time ago when I was doing so with professional people as well, that were academics, when I was parsing the stuff, which it eludes me now. I mean, I have sort of I have no credentials, so I'm just a person on the internet talking about these things, but. Okay, I'm going to have a go at it from the relativity thing. So if what I say is inaccurate, hopefully you can sort of find what it might apply to in general conceptual abstract terms. So there's a sort of compound variable which is hidden in the Einstein thing. Is that, I'm going to call it so there's a hidden compound, and that is where all the magic gets sort of contained and brushed under the carpet, basically. Because, and I think that this comes out quite clearly when you're doing special relativity stuff. You're working on an objective framework with sort of positions, with coordinates. And the middle of the universe is, like 0, 0, like in terms of the coordinates. And that's exactly where the schism happens. And also I think from that kind of perspective, that's where they get that, the famous thing that space-time is curved. Obviously now what I'm going to say is incredibly dangerous, because I'm not exactly sure what they mean by space-time being curved. I don't know if space-time gets a different curvature profile depending on the speed at which you're going. To say space-time, because as far as I can see, when they say space-time is curved, they're trying to get a sort of objective paradigm for all the objects to fit within them. Where I thought it was quite obvious that it's the speed is made up of space and time, right? So it's the speed of an object at whatever vector it's going at that's going to sort of create a relativistic, let's say, curvature. But I mean, so vectors themselves are going to have curvature profiles, but I wouldn't, that isn't that the field of space and time is curved, because the speed itself is relative. So there's a famous thought example that I often use, because everything I just said I imagine is very hard to follow. So let me just ground it in a very fixed thought experiment. So let's say you have a spaceship that leaves the planet Earth, and it's going at close to the speed of light, like 99.9% the speed of light. So it's practically the speed of light. So it launches from the planet, and it's going at a fixed destination that's sort of 6 light years away, let's say, right? So you've got a spaceship that, for all intents and purposes, let's say, it takes some time to reach up to that speed, but let's just say, on average for the thought experiment, it's going at almost the speed of light the whole way. Now, the thing that I think, because I'm pretty sure that if you do this calculation conventionally, as it's conventionally interpreted by physics departments, they get the wrong answer. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, that would sound hubristic, but yeah, okay, obviously I can't talk about details because it'll just make me sound like a lunatic, but I'm just going to tell you what the right answer is. Should I even... usually people would think in this sort of example that time has moved slower for the people that might be on the spacecraft because they've been going close to the speed of light, whereas the planet is just going at a sort of regular, relative to itself, it's perhaps, it's sort of in the same kind of motion, so it's almost static, or something like that. But the people in the spaceship have been going very, very fast relative to the planet. So the people on the spaceship will experience time more slowly. That, I believe, is... Sorry, I believe. The conventional thinking is that so the time will move faster for them. No, it's that time will move more slowly for them. Yeah, but it actually moves more quickly for them. That is my assertion. Is that the real answer is that actually the people on the spacecraft, time moves more quickly. So, what will be relative to the Earth? A 14-year journey will be for the people on the spacecraft almost an 18 or 20-year journey. And that, I believe, is counterintuitive to how they do these calculations. And I can give a general explanation for this, which is that that you have to have two sets of sort of things which you generate from this, because everyone has two speeds. So the Earth is going at two speeds in this example, and the spaceship is going at two separate speeds, and this is the thing that is not really you can't extract this from the equation. You have to sort of interpret the equations well enough that you apply them extensively enough and know where you're going. Because I do think that this deficit has been tacked on to the wrong body, as these equations are generally interpreted and applied to this particular thought example. So I'm going to give the explanation of why it is the inverse of what people usually expect it to be, which is that when the spacecraft is leaving the planet is still moving after that. So during, let's say, this is it. It's going to take years for them to get there, right? Okay, the reason why the periods that I gave are so long, because I was giving sort of real life example durations, because it's going to take at least 6 months to a year to reach almost the speed of light, and it's going to take about 6 years to start slowing down as you get towards your destination. So that's why, to go a 6 light year distance, it turns into at least a sort of 12-year, 14-year, and as I said, that for the people on board the spacecraft, it actually is a much longer duration. They end up experiencing 18 years, but for the planet Earth, they've only experienced 12 years when the spacecraft reaches its destination 6 light years away. Okay, so that's my that's what I'm going to say the answer to this thought experiment is. Now I'm going to explain the reason for this. is that the planet, so the spacecraft has just launched from the planet, okay, so they're almost the same position, and then so that at that point, let's just say the destination is 6 years away, 6 light years away, but now the Earth continues to go. It actually makes a whole lot of wasted, relative to the journey that the spacecraft has already started to undertake. The Earth is just mindlessly sort of orbiting the sun all the time, and it's slowly arcing around. But it's mainly the orbiting the sun is just, it's not even changing its position relative to the start point, let's say, or who knows how much it's really changing its position. This is the thing, is that this is also where I think relativity and quantum stuff actually sort of you can start to see the properties, how they would actually interpenetrate. Because the problem with relativity is the question of knowledge. You presume this objective positioning, but the truth is that you can't know. You have to sort of presume a coordinate. You're saying, okay, well, these are coordinates, but what does that mean? Like that the fabric of space-time has a kind of objective matrix attached to it. It's that, where the hell does that come from? That's part of how you interpret the formula that Einstein sort of, makes available. So there already is the sort of the schism, or not, but the sort of unresolvable thing, because it's like, well, how, let's say 3 years into this whole process after the spacecraft has left the planet, how far is the Earth from that point at which the spacecraft, like, you can't work that out. Honestly, you can't know what that displacement is. That itself is going to be subject to an irresolvable measurement sort of problem. You can posit, these are these coordinate positions, and now the Earth has moved. We know that the Earth is probably not going to be in the same place. Maybe it's going to be in a different place and then end up back in the same place 3 years later, but it's actually added all this, it's got this circular vector that just happened to, or maybe it's more complex than a circle because it goes further on. 5 years later, it's not going to, so it's going to loop in a circle and then it's going to go off. But all that displacement is real. And it's real in this sense. It's real relative to the speed of the things that are going. So this is my point, is that because of the Einstein fixation on this sort of objective coordinate system, which is that is actually a fiction. It's a fiction that is created just by how the math, sort of appears, and people accepted it because they love to live in a Newtonian mindscape, so they just lap it up. And this is what's caused this sort of this conceptual I can't think of the word, but why things can't move forward. Basically, it's created this impediment, this sort of to move anywhere afterwards, because once you sort of accept these equations as being true, I mean, you just anyway. Without being able to sort of think through them conceptually and see, what they're doing. But, because, I mean, basically what I'm saying is that what does it even mean that the Earth was still found its way back in that position? Okay, like that even as I say that, I'm just sort of trying to do that to show some of the inconsistency in the thinking of objective positioning. But the only thing that really matters is the speed of the planet. And I keep on saying speed, but the true philosophical language before it was tainted by Newton was momentum. Okay, I'm not going to go too much into the semantic manifestations of these issues. But okay, so my point is that wherever the Earth goes away from the journey of the spaceship, because it is relative to the speed of the Earth. So whatever the Earth, whatever time the journey is, it's part of the Earth's experience because this thing has left the Earth, right? So the Earth is going to, like, at some point, it's going to be capable of appreciating or acknowledging, you know, like when the journey is finished, let's say, and sort of it can have its own accounting of what that duration it's going to be able to describe what that duration was. And then the spaceship is going to have its own description of what the duration of the journey is. Okay, so I'm just going to make those two separate categories. But it's going to be relative to the speed of the Earth, and the speed and the speed of the spaceship, because, you know, like, you know, as they say that time is relative to well, I guess to your speed. But anyway, the point is that the speed itself is also relative. So this is the thing, is that it's not an objective fact that the spaceship is going at X speed, and it's not an objective fact that the Earth is going at X speed. Those speeds themselves are relative. So basically, relative to the Earth, the speed of the spaceship is much lower than relative to the spaceship, because they have a disagreement over where the journey started. Because as the Earth continues to move after the spaceship has left it, the starting point is moving. So it's like runners that start a race, and then the people who organize the race, who design the race, who advertise the race or whatever, they decide to pick up the starting line after the race has already commenced and move it backward. So basically, the runners themselves might have their own running watches and things like that, and it'll tell them, you know, how long it took them to cover this much distance. But the organizers of the race are going to add distance to the duration. So, or not the, are going to add distance to the race. So the speed is going to disagree, because yeah, so that is really the best, because you see, this is the thing, is that it really is relative. So legitimately, the organizers of the race can remove, can move the starting post after the race has already started, because they both get to control the race, and they both get to disagree about, therefore, the length or the spatial dimension of the race, I guess. So they actually kind of share the time, but because the time is divided over a different distance, they have different speeds. So the runners themselves are going to think that they ran a lot faster than the people who moved the starting line of the race back. So this is the sort of the non-simple. This is akin to the same phenomena as the simultaneousness of events. But because it applies to the speed, it gets a lot weirder. So usually we can't really experience these sorts of radical things practically, because you do need like light years to sort of see the effect. I'm just trying to think if I can. Yeah, so I guess the other thing that's maybe worth pointing out here is that it's unreasonable to expect the Earth to remember or account, because it cannot account for where it was objectively, because you see, this is the thing, there's no such thing as their objective coordinate. So what their objective coordinate was when the spaceship departed from the Earth, because you see, like, where the spaceship departed from was the ground on the Earth. It wasn't where the Earth was positioned in the cosmos. That is a so that's the compound variable which is conflated in the Einstein, or at least the interpretation of how Einstein's formula is applied. Because there's no way for the Earth to distinguish between the ground at which was the ground, you know, the launch site of this spacecraft, and yeah, so it's weird because on some level the Earth actually makes time in this way. It's sort of something is left from it, and that thing that leaves from it experiences more time and does something, and the Earth almost has something happen because you okay, well, I'll tell you what I mean by that profit here is that the profits in time, I mean, like, so the actual, I mean, like the savings made that the Earth sort of gets to accrue and almost steal that sense of time, is that it gets to launch a spacecraft that is moving very basically the speed of light, but it gets to believe that that spacecraft is actually only going 2/3 the speed of light because of all of the Earth's useless distance that it's accruing against the starting point of the spaceship's destination. So the spaceship is going 6 light years at the speed of light, but relative to the Earth, it's going a much longer distance. So this, let's say the speed relative to the spaceship itself is being recalculated over that longer distance, which might itself not even be is not going to be consistent at all. It's going to be somewhat complex, let's say, because the vector of the actual journey that the spacecraft takes, right, is a straight line, but the Earth is doing all these useless movements, you know, sort of that perhaps in general they kind of, most of those movements cancel them out. Some of those movements don't cancel them out. So some of those movements are actually going to alter the vector of the spacecraft. It's going to change the shape of the vector, and a lot of it is just going to, like, because, you know, for example, if you go around the sun once, depending on where the orientation of the orbit is to the vector of the spacecraft, it's going to bend the vector, but just it's that time wasting basically is what the Earth gains as a kind of profit over the inhabitants of the people undergoing that journey. I almost didn't want to say it, but maybe I should just say it so I can try and work through it, because I did get to this a long time ago when I did this thought experiment, is that almost on some level, relative to the Earth, the spacecraft can almost, relative to it, go faster than the speed of light. If you see, like, it depends how you can interpret it either way, but it sort of gives you, but that if you look at it conceptually that way, it removes the time dilation to give you a kind of shared time, which you know is not, and that's why you get this. You know, someone like me talking about math, but because yeah, so there are two, because you see, like, you can choose to displace it in time or choose to displace it in space, and because obviously you can't move faster than the speed of time, you can't go faster than the speed of light, it forces the time dilation, basically. Like, so that's where that deficit gets tacked on to it. Doesn't get tacked onto the Earth, it gets tacked onto the spacecraft that's doing the journey. Because, you know, obviously on some level you could say, well, maybe, you know, like, it depends on your point of reference, right? Because it's like, you could say that maybe, you know, just as a crazy twist on it or whatever, that the main reference is the spacecraft, and it was almost like the Earth continued on, was you know, so it's, okay, well, there's actually no point in doing that, but just identifying with being a person who's going on the spacecraft, right? So if you're a person on the spacecraft, the Earth is continuing on its merry way while you're going close to the speed of light. I guess that's the thing that is in people's heads, so that's not even hard to think about. But it's like, so as you're going towards your destination in a straight line, you're moving away from the Earth. Roughly, you're moving away from the Earth at the speed of light. When I say roughly moving away, because the Earth is a moving target as you're moving away from it. It's dancing around in a lot of wasted, you know, momentum, or, you know, so it's like its position is just sort of, you know, doing all these weird complex things as you're moving away from it. And so so I guess this is a problem of, like, a reference, because you see, like, if you're in the spacecraft, you know that you're just going in a straight line, but that the planet is sort of drifting around as you leave it behind. But yeah, that whole drifting around is not true for the people who stay on the planet, because it's relative to them. They are the point of reference. From their side, the spaceship always left the same launching part on the planet. It's only the concept of the sort of objective coordinate system that destroys that, and that objective coordinate system is not even objective. It does exist in some sense. It's not objective, but it does exist from the reference point of the spaceship. It doesn't exist from the reference point of the planet. So from the reference point of the planet, every time you coordinate how far the spaceship has gotten between you and the destination, it's like weird, because it's like, well, the spaceship isn't traveling in a straight line. They're going at the speed of light, but they're covering distance which is unnecessary, you know, because the spacecraft, let's just say, is going in one thing, but because the Earth is moving around and doing all these weird things, it looks like that the spacecraft is just messing with its own vector, and that sometimes it's just almost staying still or something like that. And on the spaceship, while that's happening, all those vector wobbling and things like that does not exist at all. That only exists for the planet. So that is where the time experience differential is coming from, is because the spacecraft knows that, oh, well, that's just because the Earth is just sort of revolving around the sun after we've already left it behind. So, we're not going to go to our destination in a corkscrew, because we've left the planet. We don't have to revolve around the sun as we go in a straight line to our destination. But because the Earth is revolving around the sun, it's looking at this vector which is completely going in a straight line, and it's saying, well, actually, the vector of the spacecraft is doing that. Like, they're actually corkscrewing their way to their destination relative to the planet. And that is a sort of irresolvable disagreement, right? But the disagreement, so I said that they have different speeds. So I guess the main thing is that they have different lengths of a journey that they are recording, because the spaceship is just going in one straight line, whereas relative to the planet, it's going in a corkscrew, which, but it's going in a corkscrew at the speed of light. I guess it's still going at the speed of light, but it's going on a longer distance. Okay, so actually I misspoke at the beginning. Slightly, but yeah, so it's still going at the speed of light, but it's going at the speed of light for longer. So relative to the Earth, the distance of the journey is dilated. So relative to the Earth, these people have gone at the speed of light for a longer distance than the people in the spacecraft. So the people in the spacecraft say, well, we've covered less space, but the people on the Earth say, no, you've actually gone further. They disagree on the distance of the journey, but you can't disagree on space, let's say. So because you can't disagree on space, they're forced. That is automatically converted into a time dilation. So, because suddenly these people that you've sent, obviously the metrics aren't going to. You don't. This is why I don't think that space-time is curved, because that implies that. The spatial metric looks different. depending on where you are, where it's only time that is relative. Yeah, so I mean, perhaps I just don't understand well enough what they're referring to when they say space-time is curved. But I have a feeling that that has to do with the Newtonian cosmology or metaphysic, which we know is bullshit anyway. But you know, that is just the scientific paradigm ever since Newton came up with that sort of mathematical way to circumvent real empiricism. Because I mean, that's what it is you just keep on building your math model, and then, you know, the empirical sort of correlation will just, you know, eventually will come to it. You know, that's the sort of Dawkins dream that, you know, it's just sort of eventually the last puzzle piece will come together. But, you know, it's philosophically, you know, what we need is an expansion of a metaphysical understanding in philosophy to actually make science work. But I still also think that, yeah, that even within that, although you can only work out relative speed, then you see, so what that comes down to is that after you work out what the time dilation is, you'll know that there will be a relative speed difference, but you won't know exactly in what direction the vector is. Like, you can't actually know that. So you see, you can know the one but not the other. So this is why I think that it actually gets you into the quantum. You can align nicely with the quantum stuff. Then, is because as the Earth was wobbling around, you knew that you were adding distance to the spacecraft's journey. But what's my point is that that's only going to have a value in time. It's not going to have a value in space. Because you're never going to be able to actually get that objective coordinate matrix, you know, down. So you can know the final value of what that time dilation is, but it's completely meaningless what the steps that made that dilation up. So, you know, like the actual path of the displacement of the Earth that caused that wobbling vector is going to be like the probability wave. That is the same thing, because it has no spatial value. It only has a value in time. Because there is a fundamental disagreement about it, because the vector is wobbling only relative to the Earth, whereas that the spaceship's vector is just a straight line. So, although you could say that, well, what the spaceship perceives or experiences as the Earth wobbling around after it's left it behind, that the Earth is projecting onto, oh well, the vector of the spaceship is wobbling around. Those do sort of cancel each other out, or they are the inverse of each other, but they're not real. So there you get that sort of superposition of waves. Is just part of the sort of the see, it's not even a mathematical symmetry. It's just part of and I must say, all of this stuff only works. It works to serve the metaphysics of, even, I would even go into consciousness and things like that. But this is going to be too long-winded to get into that stuff. But but to expand on this properly, I would have to go into actually a philosophical treatment of how time works. So is that time? yeah, maybe I'll make that a separate video. The science's treatment of time and the presumptions that are laden into the conceptual structure of what time is, which is all completely. Well, I mean, it's been. You can't get around how it's just been savaged by quantum mechanics. Has actually. At that point, we needed a kind of new conception of the scientific method, which probably, some philosophers were capable of doing. I don't know why sort of some phenomenologists didn't sort of step in there and try and make some sort of pragmatic assessment of these things. But I mean, it does have a lot of abstract things, which perhaps they just didn't have the psychological. Okay, well, yeah. I didn't want to start creating a metaphysic without sort of plumbing the depths of the psychological faculties and sort of recesses to make sure that a deep theory of mind could be expressed and sort of be happily content with whatever. Because I mean, science does have that. I mean, it's been a very good tool to generate useful, objects of kind of utilitarian value and function that we can get some work from. But to do that, I mean, science only really exploded after Newton, and he philosophically sort of mangled the thing out of any recognizable, sense of reason. The sort of the epistemological thread that Newton left is just, it's almost diabolical. But, it did explode a kind of, it suddenly became more workable for people that weren't very astute, that were. Say not intellectual enough to deal with the stuff on such a deep abstract level, but I mean, I think how much Newton was despised in his own day is a good indication of he just savaged all of the philosophical frameworks. I mean, the sort of the integrity of the language was completely destroyed. People used to talk about regularities and. So they weren't discovering these objective abstract laws. They were describing regularities. They weren't so philosophically conceited that we already existed in a kind of temporal determinism. That time itself was confined into a non-fungible property that could always just. That a quantity of time was a quantity of time, that it was completely, commodified. What was the other point? There was another good word, is that they didn't talk about quantities in the original science. They talked about magnitudes, because a magnitude was what your measurement device would be telling you was the magnitude on the device, whatever the device could be doing. There wasn't this laden presumptive, no, we've actually got the material, we've got our hands on it. It stopped becoming empirical. I think philosophically people realized that with what Newton was doing, that the sort of this mathematical puzzle building was intrinsically superficial, and it had no real reason behind it. It was very hollow, and it was basically a kind of Ponzi scheme that no, we just need to keep on doing it. We'll eventually build the brainiac math machine. That'll. I use that Superman comic book reference because I think it is incredibly apt. That the scientific wet dream, I believe, today can only be realized now if we can create an artificial intelligence that will tell us that it's more intelligent than us, and that our scientists will tell us is more intelligent than us, and it will tell us that it has had a look at science, and that science does actually work, and that we're just too stupid to ever understand what's going on there. So we'll have to take its word for it, and that'll be Brainiac. Like that is their end game of the Ponzi scheme. That's the only thing that this sort of faulty line of bullshit can. Okay. Anyway. Okay. Well, now I'm going to stop my video now. But yeah. Okay. I should have just focused actually on the quantum stuff. Because that very clearly shows how the scientific method, what the scientific method presumes and how it's structured, is completely antithetical to Bayesian statistics. Like you can't have the predictive value of something. The predictive value of a hypothesis is a yes or no. It either does have predictive value or it doesn't have predictive value. That's what the scientific method is testing. Yes, it has predictive value. No, it has predictive value. Now the answer is not yes or no. It's a statistic, and the only way to actually resolve that in your head is to basically latch onto the many worlds theory. I mean, that's the only way to get over it, which is essentially a blind faith position. I mean, it's a complete, it's just, are we really going to admit that we've been Ponzi schemed by the scientific ramblings? No, we've thrown too much good money after it. We better just believe it. We better just believe the many worlds theory. That's their only resolution, really. It is quite scary, I guess. Anyway, it's interesting because I do think that this cancer in academia is also what sort of prompted the culture war, because it's been a model for how you can create a hegemony with the semblance of authority and prestige, and how you can just sort of dress yourself in yeah, I mean, okay, well, I guess I've said enough.